3 months after she was left standing in the middle of a broken valley beside a wagon with a shattered axle, Naomi Caldwell heard a voice calling for help through a thick wall of snow. Outside, a storm had torn the roof from Warren Blackwell's barn, the same man who once stood on the ridge above her and called the shelter she had dug into the hillside a poor woman's grave. Beneath the frozen ground, her lamp was still burning, her water had not yet turned to ice, and 12 lives were waiting on the far side of the only door left standing in all of Beargrass Basin that night. If you believe that courage can turn ruin into hope, stay with Naomi's story until the end. In the early days of October 1887, Naomi rode with a small wagon train into Beargrass Basin, Wyoming Territory, carrying everything she owned in the world. A small iron stove rode behind her, along with 2 barrels of flour and dried beans, a stack of wool blankets, her father's old toolbox, a handsaw, a wood auger, an axe, coils of rope, and a few planks she had meant to use repairing the cabin on her new land. That land had been chosen by her husband before a sawmill accident took his life, and Naomi had come west not to build a fortune, but to finish the life the 2 of them had never gotten the chance to start. When the wagons were still nearly 2 miles from her claim, the rear axle gave way without warning, and the wagon tipped hard, throwing Naomi down into the mud beside the road. Dean Sutter, the man Warren Blackwell had sent along under the name of an escort, announced flatly that the wagon could not be repaired before the first heavy snow of the season. He offered her 2 choices, plain and cold as the wind coming down off the ridge. She could sign the land back over to Warren for $40 and ride into town with the rest of the train. Or she could stay behind with a broken wagon and whatever she could carry. Naomi understood immediately that the offer was an insult dressed up as mercy, since the lumber alone on her wagon was worth nearly that much money on its own, and she refused to sign anything. Dean unhitched the team, claiming the horses belonged to the freight company rather than to her, then had the last of the shared provisions loaded onto another wagon before riding off with the rest of the train. Travis Hale, a young hand riding with them, glanced back at her once but said nothing, and by the time the light began to fail, the train had vanished behind a low line of hills, leaving Naomi alone beside a tilted wagon on a gray and darkening plain. She walked the short distance to the cabin site her husband had chosen and found only a blackened stone foundation, the roof door, and half the walls long since gone to fire or time or both. That first night, she slept curled inside the leaning wagon box, listening to wolves calling somewhere across the basin and to wind combing through the gaps between the boards above her head. Before she let herself sleep, she found the broken axle pin lying a good distance from the wheel, farther than any ordinary brake should have thrown it, and one end of it caught a strange gleam in the last of the light, though the dark kept her from understanding what she was looking at. Something in her would not let the thought go, a growing certainty that the wagon had not simply failed, but had been made ready to fail at that exact place on the road. By morning, a thin skin of frost had formed on the inside walls of the wagon box, a quiet warning that Naomi did not have much time left to waste on grief. Naomi walked nearly 4 miles to Blackwell Crown, Warren's ranch, passing a 2-story cattle barn, freshly built fences, an enormous hay barn, and a row of thick posts lining the entrance road like monuments to a man's authority. Warren received her in a warm room, but did not offer her a chair, speaking with a courteous voice while telling her plainly that no woman alone could survive a Wyoming winter on her own. He explained that her claim sat directly at the mouth of Hollow Pass, the natural corridor his cattle used to escape the worst of the north wind, and he made no secret of wanting it, calling his offer an arrangement that would benefit them both. When Naomi asked why the wagon had broken apart at the exact moment his own man was escorting it, Warren sidestepped the question entirely, only remarking that a blizzard cared nothing for who was in the right. He raised his offer to $60 and gave her 3 days to accept it. And once again, Naomi refused. As she left the ranch house, some of the hired men laughed at the mud on her coat and the torn seam of her boot, and Travis muttered under his breath that she ought to dig herself a grave while she still had the strength. Standing before the gathered hands, Warren announced that by Christmas, her land would be empty one way or another. In town, no one Naomi asked was willing to repair her wagon, since none of them wished to cross a man as powerful as Warren Blackwell. Cole Barrett, the town's blacksmith, examined the broken axle pin quietly and noticed that the metal had been sawed nearly halfway through before it ever failed, though he was not yet ready to say so out loud, only warning Naomi that this was no ordinary wear. Sadie Rowe, who ran a small inn in Beargrass, fed her a bowl of soup and offered her a bed for the night. But Naomi turned the offer down, knowing that too many nights away from her claim would give Warren a reason to say she had abandoned it herself. Before Naomi walked back out into the cold, Sadie lent her a short-handled shovel and told her not to build anything the wind could see, a sentence that lodged itself deep in Naomi's mind. It called back memories of the tool sheds her father used to dig into hillsides when he built wooden bridges back in Pennsylvania, structures that let the weather pass over them instead of standing against it. By the time Naomi reached her land again, she no longer looked at the ruined wagon as a vehicle that had failed her. She began to see it instead as the bones of a house waiting to be given shape, and that single shift in her thinking changed the direction of everything that followed. Rather than start digging at once, Naomi surveyed her land carefully, tying strips of cloth to stakes and watching how the wind moved through the basin for 2 full days. She learned that the strongest gusts came down from the northwest, and that a low southeastern slope near the burned foundation sat almost entirely out of their direct path. That same ground stood higher than the creek bed nearby, reducing any danger of flooding, and beneath its topsoil of grass and clay lay a layer of gravel that would carry water away instead of holding it. She decided against repairing the wagon for travel and chose instead to take it apart piece by piece, burying the wagon box into the hillside as the heart of a shelter built to outlast a storm rather than outrun one. Her plan called for a wide trench cut deep into the slope, with the wagon box set inside to serve as the central sleeping chamber, burned fence timbers used as bracing beams outside it, and the old wagon canvas laid down as a barrier against dampness. Earth and grass would cover the roof so the wind would slide across it instead of striking it directly, and the entrance would bend at an angle to help trap warmth inside. To test her thinking, she built a small model from sticks and wet earth, and when she piled extra dirt on top, the center gave way immediately, proving that the wagon box alone could never bear the weight above it. She revised the design so that the wagon box formed only an inner room, with the main roof carried instead by a set of independent posts arranged in a low A-frame shape meant to spread the load evenly to either side. While Naomi worked, Warren and Dean rode past on horseback and studied the open trench and the half-dismantled wagon with open contempt. Dean called it a wooden coffin, and Warren remarked that Naomi was saving the town the cost of burying her. Naomi said nothing back, only marking the next depth she needed to reach onto the handle of her shovel and returning to her work. Cole quietly brought her a new drill bit and a handful of long nails in exchange for mending his coat, and though he offered to help her dig, she accepted only a single afternoon of his labor, wanting every joint in the shelter to be one she understood completely, since when the storm finally came, there might be no one left beside her to fix a mistake. Digging through her father's toolbox one evening, Naomi found a brass plumb bob and remembered something he used to tell her, that a structure did not need to be beautiful to stand firm. It only needed to understand where the weight wanted to travel. That single idea became the guiding principle behind everything she built from that point forward. By the close of the third day, she set the first foundation stone into the bottom of the trench and called the place home, even though above her there was still nothing but open sky. For the first 3 days of construction, Naomi dug a drainage trench around the slope before ever touching the main chamber, a choice that drew even louder mockery from anyone passing by who assumed she was wasting precious time. She laid a bed of gravel beneath the floor and set boards salvaged from the wagon's flooring on top, creating a gap that kept her sleeping space away from the damp earth below. On the fourth day, she removed both wheels from the wagon, using the iron rim of one to frame a secondary vent and keeping the other whole to serve as the collar of a rear escape hatch, while the axle itself was laid across 2 stone piers, used not as a main support beam but as a locking bar to keep the structure from shifting sideways. Over the following 3 days, she lowered the wagon box into the trench, using a rope wound around the base of a nearby tree, and when the rope slipped, the box dropped faster than she expected, nearly crushing her leg beneath it and cracking one corner, which she repaired with boards pulled from the wagon's side panel. She raised 6 cottonwood posts, salvaged from an old fence line, resting each one on a flat stone to keep it from rotting, and laid long timbers across them to form a low roof, sloping down on either side, weaving the curved bows that had once held the wagon's canvas between the beams to keep the structure from shaking. On the 8th day, she tested the roof by spreading a layer of earth across part of it, and a sharp cracking sound announced 2 beams sliding out of position on the left side, forcing her to jump clear before that section collapsed and buried 2 full days of labor beneath the dirt. That collapse brought Naomi closer to giving up than anything else in the entire ordeal, and sitting beside a fallen wheel, the memory of her husband's death rushed back to her at the sound of splitting wood, filling her with a fear that she was repeating the same disaster that had already taken everything from her once. When she examined the wreckage more carefully, though, she realized the fault lay not in her overall design, but in posts that had never been properly locked at their base, and she dug new channels, set timber footings, and wedged each post firmly in place before trying again. Over the next 3 days, she rebuilt the roof, layering small branches to hold the soil, spreading canvas as a moisture barrier, adding a cushion of dry grass for insulation, packing a layer of clay, and finally replacing sod in whole sections rather than loose dirt, keeping the covering just thick enough to protect without turning the roof into a crushing weight. The main door was set off center from the sleeping chamber, forcing 2 sharp turns that kept wind from blowing straight through, and the wagon's own double doors became the shelter's inner and outer barrier. The iron stove was placed on a stone base, its chimney passing through a narrow ring of rock that kept it from touching the wooden beams directly. On the 12th day, Naomi finished a rear escape tunnel narrow enough for only one person to crawl through, with a long pole stored beneath the vent so she could push snow clear if the opening ever became sealed, and she strung a guide rope from the hatch down to a nearby creek so she could find her way in a storm. 2 tall marker poles rose from the roof, meant to show where the shelter stood even after heavy snow buried everything else around it. Dean returned during construction to claim that some of the timber Naomi had used belonged to the Blackwell fence line, but she showed him the old burn scars proving the wood sat entirely within her own boundary, so he could not take it, though he warned her that Warren would not allow her to block the cattle trail forever. That same night, a stack of her reserve firewood disappeared, and Naomi found horse tracks leading back toward Blackwell Crown, though she chose not to chase them, turning instead to dismantle the wagon tongue to use as a replacement brace. The first night she slept fully underground. The heat from her stove kept the chamber noticeably warmer than the world outside, even as the earliest snow of the season began to fall silently across the roof above her. Word of the buried house spread quickly through town, and people gave it several names, calling it the Caldwell Rat Hole, the Coffin with a Chimney, or the Poor Woman's Grave. Warren led a group of business partners past her land to admire his cattle, deliberately stopping in front of the shelter and asking Naomi if she intended to live underground like an animal. She answered that animals knew enough to find low ground before a storm arrived, while people usually built too high just to prove how wealthy they were, and the reply embarrassed Warren in front of his guests. He raised his offer to a full $100, but added a demand that she leave that very day, and once again, Naomi refused. Warren warned her that a shelter that kept a person warm could just as easily become their grave if the door ever froze shut under the snow. Though Naomi did not tell him, she had already built a second way out. Cole returned to check her chimney, and she showed him the broken axle pin. And after scraping away the dried mud, he confirmed that the cut ran straight and even, that the metal had been sawed nearly halfway through, and that only a short stretch of rough road would have been enough to snap what remained. Naomi wanted to confront Warren directly, but Cole warned her that the word of a blacksmith alone would never outweigh the power of a ranch owner without witnesses standing beside it. So she locked the iron pin away inside her toolbox instead. Rather than preparing only for herself, she began widening the shelter's second chamber, adding 2 benches along the wall, storing extra water in wooden barrels, building racks for blankets, and digging a food store separate from the stove. Sadie asked her plainly why she was preparing space for people who had done nothing but laugh at her, and Naomi answered that she knew what it felt like to stand outside a closed door in the cold, and she had no wish to become the one who shut that door on someone else. Far down the valley, flocks of birds began leaving earlier than usual that season, even as Warren ordered his men to raise the roof of his new barn a little higher still. The first light snowfalls gave Naomi a chance to test her shelter properly, and she found 3 problems waiting for her: moisture gathering on the ceiling, smoke reversing course whenever the wind shifted, and meltwater creeping toward the door. She refused to treat any of it as failure, choosing instead to see each flaw as an early warning she could still correct in time. She opened a second low vent near the floor to encourage a steady current of air, fitted a curved sheet of iron over the chimney, dug the drainage trench deeper and lined it with stone, and built a low porch roof over the entrance, using the old wagon tongue. To study the airflow, she sealed the door for a full hour and lit 3 candles at different heights. And when the flame nearest the floor began to weaken, she adjusted the vent until it steadied. She fixed a long pole beside her bed so she could clear the airway from inside without stepping out into the cold, and she used the last of the canvas to build a small pen for 2 goats that Sadie had traded her, separating the animals from her living space with a wooden partition so their warmth would help without fouling the air she breathed. Cole helped her hang a small bell on a post outside the door, its cord running inside so anyone caught outside in a storm could signal for help without needing to find the exact location of the entrance. The bond between Cole and Naomi grew slowly and quietly, neither one asking the other too many questions, she never pressing him about why he always lowered his eyes before Warren, and he never asking about her husband, both of them understanding that each carried some private cowardice or grief they were not yet ready to speak aloud. Naomi began noticing signs that troubled her: wild rabbits burrowing unusually deep into the brush, cattle turning their backs to the west even before any wind had risen, and a pale ring forming around the moon above a valley that had gone strangely, heavily quiet. She began recording the morning temperature by watching how quickly water froze in a set of matching containers, and the speed of the changes convinced her that whatever storm was coming would be far worse than anything they had seen so far that season. One morning, Naomi opened her door to find that Warren's cattle had broken through their own fence overnight, moving on instinct toward the low ground surrounding her shelter. She walked to Blackwell Crown to warn him, explaining that every sign pointed to a massive wall of snow being driven down from the northwest. But she arrived to find Warren busy preparing a winter gathering for a group of cattle buyers. He proudly showed off his new barn, boasting of its tall roof, its wide doors facing straight out across open pasture, and its capacity to house hundreds of head of cattle at once, while Naomi immediately noticed that the roof stood far too high, and the doors faced almost directly into the strongest gusts the wind could throw. She urged him to move his cattle down to lower ground, reinforce his doors, split the herd instead of packing every animal under a single roof, and dig some kind of temporary shelter for his hired men. But Warren accused her of trying to frighten him into paying her money, or winning her some measure of recognition. Dean claimed her shelter had only survived so far because it had never truly faced a real storm, and Travis stayed quiet, careful to avoid meeting her eyes. Naomi gave one final warning, telling them that if the barn roof ever began to shudder, they needed to leave immediately, without pausing to gather their belongings, and Warren answered that something costing $3,000 would never be defeated by a pile of dirt. Back on her own land, Naomi threw herself into final preparations, splitting her firewood into small, manageable bundles, filling every water barrel to the brim, tying guide ropes toward the creek and the hay stores, packing dried food into small sacks, checking the escape hatch one last time, driving extra marker stakes along the path, and bringing the goats fully indoors. Sadie decided to close the inn and move down to the shelter before the snow arrived. And Cole brought his own toolbox along as well, though he still planned to ride back into town to help reinforce the church roof before returning. Naomi told him plainly to be back before dark. By late afternoon, the western sky turned a sickly shade of yellow-gray, and the valley fell utterly silent. No birdsong, no insects, no lowing of distant cattle anywhere at all. Then the first true gust arrived, strong enough to snap a fence post clean in half. From the door of her shelter, Naomi could see the lamps still burning brightly at Blackwell Crown, glowing as though some grand party was only just about to begin. The storm arrived far faster than anyone had predicted, snow driving sideways across the ground like blowing sand instead of falling straight from the sky. Naomi shut the outer door and waited at the inner one, with Sadie beside her, cutting down on the heat they lost with every opening. The wind slid across the earthen roof instead of slamming into a standing wall, and the shelter shuddered slightly, but never groaned the way a wooden structure exposed above ground would have. When Cole failed to return, Naomi tied a rope around her waist and followed the guide line back out into the storm, finding him less than 50 steps from the door, his sled overturned and his leg pinned beneath the tongue. She used a lever cut from an old wagon tongue to lift the wood enough to free him, and together they crawled back along the rope toward the shelter, the falling snow erasing every trace of the wrecked sled within minutes of their passing. Inside, Naomi checked Cole's leg and found no broken bone, and soon after, the bell outside the door began ringing without warning. Travis appeared out of the storm along with 2 other hands from Blackwell Crown, all 3 having fled the barn just as its doors began tearing loose from their hinges, one man's hand badly frostbitten, another struggling to breathe after inhaling driven snow. Travis stared in disbelief at what waited inside the so-called grave, air moving freely, a dry floor, water that had not frozen, and a stove burning steadily despite everything raging outside. Naomi did not bring up the old mockery. She simply set Travis to work warming the injured man's hands with dry cloth, careful to keep him away from direct contact with the fire. Travis admitted that many people were still trapped at the ranch, including Warren and Dean, since part of the barn roof had already torn loose but Warren refused to leave, while his prized breeding cattle remained inside. Naomi understood that going out to help them might mean she never found her way back at all. And Sadie objected loudly, reminding her that Warren had once tried to force her toward her own death. Naomi answered that if she let him die out there, then this shelter would only ever be the place where she survived, never the place she had truly built. She organized a rescue party of herself, Cole, and Travis, tying all three together on a single rope with enough distance between them that the wind could not knock them all down at once. Carrying blankets, a storm lamp, and a length of chain pulled from the old wagon, one end of the main rope stayed anchored to the buried axle deep inside the shelter itself. Visibility in the storm shrank to almost nothing beyond the light directly ahead of them, and at one point a flying fence post shattered Travis's lamp entirely. Cole wanted to turn back, but Naomi caught the sound of a cattle bell somewhere inside the howling wind and pushed forward until they reached Blackwell Crown, where they found the western barn doors torn completely off their hinges, a section of roof rising and slamming down again and again, cattle crowded in panic into one corner, and hired men straining to hold the last door shut with rope alone. Naomi shouted for everyone to clear the barn immediately, but Warren refused to leave while a group of his breeding stock remained trapped inside. At that exact moment, a long groaning crack tore through the main roof beam above them, and Naomi looked up to see the entire structure beginning to shift directly toward Warren. Naomi lunged toward Warren the instant the roof began its collapse, shoving him clear of his original position, though a secondary beam still came down and pinned them both against a blocked exit. Dean bolted for the open air, abandoning his own employer without a backward glance, while Cole and Travis rushed in to help. Warren's leg was trapped beneath the fallen timber, and Naomi hooked the old wagon chain around the beam, wrapping its other end around a short post that had somehow remained standing. Cole used a length of iron as a lever while Travis pulled the chain taut, and together they raised the beam just high enough, for only a few precious seconds, for Naomi to drag Warren free before the rest of the roof came down entirely. Warren lost a boot and injured his leg in the fall, but remained fully conscious, and when he saw the old wagon chain wrapped around the beam, he recognized it at once as belonging to the very wagon he had once left broken and abandoned. Naomi ordered everyone out of the barn immediately, refusing to let anyone risk their life trying to salvage property while the structure was still failing around them, and she directed the men to open a low southern fence so the cattle could run down toward the hollow near her shelter on their own. Some of the animals were lost or killed in the chaos, a stark and honest cost that the storm demanded regardless of anyone's effort, and Naomi could not bring the entire herd to safety. Managing only to guide a smaller group of breeding cattle into a shallow gully beside the slope, stacking bundled hay as a windbreak, and opening the small livestock pen for the weakest animals among them. On the way back, Dean broke free from the rope in a fit of panic and vanished into the blowing snow, his cries reaching Naomi's ears without any way for her to tell which direction they came from. Travis followed the line of a fence and found Dean collapsed in a snow-filled hollow, and despite everything, Naomi still ordered him pulled back towards safety. As the group neared the shelter, they found that the first marker pole had already snapped in the wind, and the second stood barely visible above the drifting snow, forcing Naomi to crawl on her hands and search blindly beneath the surface until her fingers finally closed around the buried guide rope. At last, the bell outside the door rang under her hand. Sadie opened the entrance exactly as they had practiced, the outer door first, everyone crowding into the small buffer space between the two barriers. The outer door sealed shut again before the inner one finally opened to let them through. In total, 12 people crowded into the shelter that night. Warren looked around in stunned silence, finally understanding that every piece he had once mocked served an exact purpose. The low roof that the wind could not lift, the packed earth that held the warmth inside, the angled doorway that kept the snow from driving straight in, the buried axle anchoring the whole frame, and the iron wheel rim keeping the vent from collapsing under pressure. Just as the group began to settle, the flame inside the stove suddenly weakened, a clear sign that the main air vent outside had become sealed beneath a fresh weight of snow. On the first day, the air inside slowly grew heavier, and Naomi told everyone to dim the lamps, keep the fire low, avoid crowding around the stove, and make sure nothing blocked the low vents near the floor. She used a long pole to push through the wheel rim above and break apart the packed snow, and a rush of cold air confirmed the passage had finally cleared. Watching her work, Warren began to understand for the first time that the shelter was not some reckless notion, but a structure refined again and again through careful trial. On the second day, the wind grew even stronger, and the main door became completely blocked by snow, and Dean, gripped by panic, convinced himself the shelter had become nothing more than a tomb and tried to force the outer bolt open. Naomi stopped him, explaining that the pressure of the wind outside could tear both doors free at once if the sealed buffer between them was opened out of order. But Dean refused to listen and shoved her to the ground in his desperation. Warren, injured as he was, ordered Dean to stand down, marking the first time he had openly stood on Naomi's side against his own man. In his fury, Dean blurted out that Warren had no right to blame him for anything, since it was Warren himself who had ordered him to make sure she was gone before winter set in. The entire shelter fell silent at those words. Travis looked over at Dean and finally confessed what he had been carrying since the very first day, that he had seen Dean cutting into the axle pin the night before the wagon train ever left, weakening the metal on purpose, and that fear of losing his job had kept him silent ever since. Warren admitted he had ordered pressure applied to force Naomi off her land, but insisted he had never known Dean intended to sabotage the wagon itself. Naomi chose not to argue the point in that moment, telling them all that the truth could wait until after they had survived, and her calm in the face of the confession completely overturned whatever authority had once existed inside that shelter. By the third day, their firewood had grown thin, and Naomi tore loose one of the unnecessary boards from the old wagon box to burn, accepting the sacrifice of the last remaining piece of her former life. Water was carefully rationed, and everyone leaned on shared blankets and body heat rather than pushing the fire any higher than it needed to be. The wind outside finally began to ease, but the main door remained hopelessly blocked. So Naomi turned to the escape hatch instead, crawling through the narrow passage and pressing her shoulder against the wooden cover at its end. The snow above proved far too deep to push through alone, so Cole and Travis braced themselves behind her and pushed as well, until the cover finally broke free and opened a small hole out into the surface of the drifted snow. Naomi climbed out into a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural. Looking around, all she could see were low white mounds, marking where houses and barns had once stood across the valley. Beneath her feet, the shelter remained entirely intact, while across the basin, the largest ranch in all of Beargrass had very nearly ceased to exist. Naomi and Cole worked together to dig out the main door from the outside, and one by one, all 12 people stepped out into the light of the storm's end. Survivors from town made their way toward Naomi's land as well, since her 2 marker stakes stood among the very few landmarks still visible above the endless white. The damage across the valley was severe, with many roofs collapsed, a portion of Warren's herd dead, his hay stores blown away entirely, and even the town church badly damaged, though remarkably, not a single person sheltering underground with Naomi had lost their life. Warren could no longer hide the truth from anyone. In front of Sadie, Cole, Travis, and the other survivors gathered there, he admitted that he had deliberately tried to force Naomi off her land. Travis openly described watching Dean sabotage the axle pin, and Cole produced the cut metal itself as physical proof, leaving Dean with no protection left from Warren at all. Dean was handed over to county authorities to answer for both the sabotage and for knowingly abandoning another person out in the wilderness. Warren offered to purchase the shelter outright and hire Naomi to build similar structures across his own ranch, but she refused to sell any part of her land. Instead, she set her own conditions: that Warren provide the lumber, tools, and labor needed to build community shelters throughout the valley, that Hollow Pass remain open to everyone, rather than serving only Blackwell cattle, and that families who had lost their homes be allowed to use the low ground around her shelter until spring arrived. Warren accepted every term, not simply out of guilt, but because the entire community had now seen exactly how fragile his authority truly was. Naomi did not offer forgiveness in that moment, telling him plainly that saving a man's life did not erase what he had done. In the weeks that followed, people who had once called her shelter a grave began using her own designs to dig places of refuge for their own families. Spring arrived late, but Beargrass Basin slowly began to heal itself. 6 new storm shelters rose around the valley, each one following the same principles Naomi had discovered on her own, built into wind-sheltered slopes, roofed low to the ground, fitted with double doors, and equipped with proper drainage and backup ventilation. Naomi did not become wealthy overnight, and she still tended her own garden, mended her own fences, and worked through her days much as she always had. Yet no one crossed her land anymore without stopping to ask her opinion on wind direction or roof framing. Warren lost a substantial portion of his herd and was forced to sell off land to cover the cost of rebuilding. His influence visibly diminished across the valley. Travis left Blackwell Crown for good, going to work alongside Cole, and taking on responsibility for inspecting the new storm shelters as they were built. Sadie hung a board inside her inn, listing the names of every survivor from that night, though Naomi asked that her own name not be given the largest place among them. Cole helped her plant a row of windbreak trees along the ridge, but only after she had agreed to it herself, and whatever was growing quietly between them was left open and unhurried, never turned into some reward for having survived a disaster. Naomi kept one wagon wheel that she never buried, mounting it above the entrance to her shelter as a signal to any traveler passing through that shelter could always be found there. In the story's final image, a small group of travelers moves across Beargrass Basin as storm clouds gather again on the horizon, and this time no one among them panics. Lamps begin lighting one by one along the hillsides below. Above the very first shelter ever built, the broken wagon wheel turns gently in the spring wind, and the very thing once used to abandon Naomi Caldwell has become a lasting sign that no one in that valley will ever be left behind again.